My 5-year-old spotted a gas leak the inspectors missed and saved the whole street. The fire marshal looked at my daughter's crayon drawing for a long time before he said anything. Long enough that I started to feel the specific discomfort of watching a grown professional in an official capacity try to figure out how to respond to a piece of artwork made by a kindergartner without either dismissing it or admitting that a 5-year-old had understood something his certified team of inspectors had spent 3 days missing. The drawing was taped to our refrigerator. It showed our house, our neighbor's house, and the 4 houses beyond that, all rendered in the wobbly, confident lines of a child who draws everything with absolute commitment regardless of technical accuracy. And running beneath all 6 houses in yellow crayon, it was a thick, wavy line that my daughter Nadia had labeled in her phonetic invented spelling as the smelly snake. She'd drawn it on a Monday. The gas company's emergency crew had confirmed the rupture on a Wednesday. The rupture that, according to Fire Marshal Douglas Ibarra, with 22 years in municipal fire services, had been perhaps 72 hours away from reaching a concentration level that could have killed everyone on our block while they slept. My name is Theo Okafor, and I want to be precise about who I am before I tell you what happened, because the precision matters. I'm a 41-year-old high school biology teacher in Millbrook, Ohio, which is a mid-sized city that considers itself a suburb, but is really just a city that ran out of ambition at some point in the 1980s and decided to call the resulting stillness charm. I've lived on Crescent Mill Road for 6 years, since my wife Adaize and I bought our house 2 months after our wedding, attracted by the old trees and the wide front porches, and the mortgage payment that was roughly half of what the equivalent space would cost in Columbus. Our street is the kind of street that real estate listings describe as established and quiet, which means the houses are older, the neighbors know each other by name, and nothing particularly dramatic has ever happened there. I teach AP Biology and 2 sections of General Science, and I coach the chess club on Thursdays with the particular low-key enthusiasm of a person who was never good enough at chess to be arrogant about it. Adaize is a pediatric occupational therapist who works at a clinic 40 minutes away and is, by any reasonable measure, the more competent parent in our household. A fact she would deny out of politeness, and that I acknowledge freely because it costs me nothing and is simply true. Our daughter Nadia is 5 years old. She starts kindergarten in the fall and has been conducting what I can only describe as an extended research project into the sensory properties of the physical world. Smelling things, touching things, categorizing sounds. Alma reporting her findings with the earnest precision of a scientist who has not yet learned that most adults stopped paying attention to the physical world around age 9 and have been winging it on pattern recognition ever since. She has always been a smeller. That's the word Adaize and I use for it. Nadia smells things. Not in an anxious way, not compulsively, just in the way that some people are primarily visual or primarily auditory. She navigates the world through her nose with a specificity that I, as a biology teacher, find genuinely interesting and that occasionally makes grocery shopping an extended sensory expedition. She could tell you the difference between the smell of rain coming and rain arrived. She knew when Adaize was baking something even from 2 floors away and could usually identify what it was before she reached the kitchen. She'd told me once, with complete seriousness, that our neighbor Mr. Fontaine's car smelled sad, which I dismissed as imaginative language, until Adaize pointed out that the car probably had a slow oil burn, and Nadia was detecting the specific smell of degraded engine oil, which does in fact have a particular melancholy quality if you know how to pay attention to it. The first time Nadia mentioned the smell, I was grading lab reports at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening in late March. She came downstairs from where she'd been playing in her room and stood in the kitchen doorway with the particular expression she gets when she's processing something. Slightly unfocused eyes, or her head tilted about 15 degrees to the right. She told me the backyard smelled like the camping stove, which is how she described the smell of propane, the small portable unit we used on camping trips. I told her it was probably just the wind carrying something from a neighbor's yard, maybe someone grilling late. She considered this seriously, the way she considers most things, then said that, no, it wasn't from a neighbor's yard. It was coming from underground, from under the grass. I remember the specific quality of the inattention I gave this information, a kind of automated parental acknowledgement that processes the words without really hearing them, a nod and a, interesting, that said, I've registered your communication, and please allow me to continue what I was doing." She went back upstairs. I finished grading. The moment existed and passed without consequence. That was the first time. The second time was 4 days later, on a Thursday morning. I was making Nadia's lunch before school. Peanut butter and apples, the specific arrangement she required. No crusts, apples on the left side of the container. When she came into the kitchen and stopped near the back door, she pressed her nose to the gap at the bottom of the door, which is a thing she does occasionally, and which I've largely stopped commenting on because commenting on it never changes anything. She stood up and told me the smelly snake was bigger. I asked what smelly snake. She explained that the camping stove smell underground had spread, that it was wider now than last week. She gestured with her hands to show me the width, ice spreading them apart to indicate something approximately the span of her small arm span. I remember setting down the apple I was slicing and actually looking at her, giving her the kind of direct attention that the lab report grading had failed to provide. I asked her to show me what she meant, and she led me out to the back porch and pointed to the yard, then to the fence, then vaguely toward the houses beyond our fence line. I stood on the back porch in the early morning cold and breathed in as carefully as I could. I smelled grass and mud and the particular mineral smell of Ohio Spring, and faintly, very faintly, something that might have been gas or might have been my imagination working overtime because my 5-year-old had just told me there was an underground smell spreading through our neighborhood. I told her I'd look into it. You see, I told myself it was her imagination. I went back inside and finished making lunch. The moment existed and passed. I didn't look into it. That was the second time, and the one I've spent the most time sitting with since. The third time was the Sunday after that, and this time I couldn't rationalize it away with any real conviction. Nadia had asked me the night before if she could draw the smelly snake for me so I could see what she meant, and I'd said yes, the way you say yes to most things a 5-year-old asks when the alternative is explaining why no. She brought the drawing to me at breakfast. 6 houses in a row, all recognizable despite the artistic liberties, each labeled with its own crayon approximation of the family name. She'd gotten most of them phonetically close enough to be decipherable. Mr. Fontaine next door was Fontan, while with the Delacroix family 2 houses down was Dlacqua, and beneath all 6 houses, the thick, yellow, wavy line, the smelly snake. She explained that she'd tried to draw how big the smell was underground, and that the line went under all of them, and that it was getting stronger near Mr. Fontaine's house because she could smell it a little bit even from our front porch when the wind came from the north. I looked at that drawing for a long time. I am a biology teacher. I understand gas dispersion. I understand that certain gases have lower densities than air and will rise, and that a buried gas line rupture produces a slow seeping accumulation that builds over time, and that the distinctive rotten egg odorant added to natural gas for exactly this detection purpose is identifiable to humans at concentrations as low as 0.5 parts per million. I understand all of this, and I had been standing in my backyard for the better part of a week, inhaling what my 5-year-old was accurately reporting as a growing underground smell and convincing myself I was imagining it, because a child had told me about it first and some part of my adult brain had categorized the information accordingly. I took the drawing off the breakfast table and taped it to the refrigerator, which is where it was when the fire marshal saw it 11 days later. Then I picked up my phone and called the gas company's non-emergency line. The woman who answered my call at Midwest Natural Gas's customer service line was polite and efficient, and clearly working from a script designed to field exactly this kind of call, which told me they received enough of them that the script existed for a reason. She took my address. Almer took my description of the smell, asked me a series of standardized questions about whether I'd noticed any dead vegetation, any visible ground disturbance, any hissing sounds, any bubbling and standing water. I said I hadn't noticed those specific signs, but that the smell had been growing over the course of approximately a week, and that I had reason to believe it extended beneath multiple properties along our block. She told me they'd send an inspector within 48 hours, and that if I noticed any intensification or saw any of the specific warning signs, I should call 911 immediately. I thanked her and hung up. The 48 hours felt adequate. I told Adeze about the call, and she looked at Nadia's drawing on the refrigerator for a moment and said we should probably let the neighbors know, just as a precaution. I said I'd wait until the inspector came, not wanting to cause alarm over something that might turn out to be minor. That was a decision I've also sat with. The inspector came on a Wednesday morning. His name was Phil Dearborn, and he arrived in a white Midwest natural gas truck at 9:14 a.m., which I know because I'd taken a half day off work specifically to be there. He was a compact man somewhere in his mid-50s, with the practiced efficiency of someone who's done his job long enough to have developed strong opinions about which parts of it require real attention and which parts are routine. He asked me to describe the smell again, and I did. He took out a handheld gas detector, a yellow rectangular unit that I later learned was a combustible gas indicator, specifically a CGI model designed to detect methane concentrations above a certain threshold, and walked the perimeter of our backyard, holding it low near the ground. He checked the meter connection at the side of the house, checked the visible section of line where it entered the foundation, walked the fence line twice. He spent 18 minutes total on the property, which felt thorough in the moment. He came back to where I was standing on the back porch and told me his detector hadn't registered anything above background levels, that the connection points were all secure, that he didn't believe there was an active leak on or immediately adjacent to my property, and that the smell I detected was likely methane bleed from decaying organic matter in the soil. Which is a thing that can happen in spring thaw conditions and which can produce a faint gas-like odor that residents sometimes mistake for a leak. He said this with the particular authority of someone who was not inviting further questions, and I absorbed his conclusion with the particular credulity of someone who has just been told by a professional that their concern was unfounded and who very much wants to believe that's true. He left at 9:32 a.m., I called a Daisy and told her the inspector said it was fine. She asked what the inspector said specifically, and I told her what he'd said about organic decay. There was a pause on her end of the line that I recognized as the pause she makes when she's deciding whether to say what she's thinking. And then she said, "Okay," in a way that meant several things simultaneously. That evening, Nadia came to find me after dinner. I was in the living room watching something on television that I don't remember because I wasn't really watching it. She sat next to me on the couch and after a few minutes said that the smelly snake was angry today. I asked what she meant. She said it smelled much stronger than yesterday, that it was coming through the basement now, not just the yard. My stomach moved in a way that had nothing to do with dinner. I stood up and went to the basement door and opened it and stood at the top of the stairs and breathed in carefully. And this time, there was no ambiguity, no possibility of imagining it. No mental negotiation available to me. The smell of gas was present in the basement air, not overpowering, not the dense, dangerous concentration you read about in disaster accounts, but present and unmistakable, a sulfurous chemical note underneath the usual basement smell of concrete and stored things, faint, growing. I closed the door and called a Daisy from the kitchen and told her what I was smelling. She was at the top of the stairs before I finished the sentence. She took one breath at the basement door, looked at me, and said, "We need to call 911. I called at 8:51 p.m. The dispatcher asked if anyone in the household was experiencing symptoms: headache, nausea, dizziness. I said not yet. She told me to get everyone outside immediately, not to use any light switches or appliances, not to use our phones inside the house, and to stay outside until the response crew arrived. We went out the front door, Nadia between us holding both our hands, wearing her coat over her pajamas. She looked up at me on the front porch and said, in the mildly told-you-so tone that 5-year-olds apparently develop independently, regardless of parenting approach, "The smelly snake was trying to tell you." The first response vehicle arrived 11 minutes later. It was a Millbrook Fire Department truck, engine 7, and the crew of 4 moved with the kind of efficient urgency that meant they were taking this seriously. Captain Renata Solis, 14 years with the Millbrook FD, introduced herself on our front walk and asked me to describe what I'd smelled and where. I told her everything, including the 5 days of prior detection that Nadia had reported, the call to the gas company, the inspector's visit and conclusion, and the basement smell this evening. She listened without interrupting. I then looked down at Nadia and asked her directly what the smell was like, the way some adults are good at addressing children as actual sources of information rather than as accessories to the adults next to them. Nadia told Captain Solis it smelled like the camping stove but underground and that it went under all the houses on the block, not just ours. Captain Solis asked her how she knew it went under the other houses. Nadia said because she could smell it stronger near Mr. Fontaine's house than near ours, and that smells are stronger when they're closer to where they start. Captain Solis looked at me briefly with an expression I couldn't quite read, and then said her crew was going to begin atmospheric monitoring across the full block length. Not just our property, the full block. I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't known was clenched. What happened in the next 4 hours is the kind of procedural escalation that seems slow while you're living inside it and terrifyingly fast in retrospect. Captain Solis's crew ran atmospheric readings along the full length of Crescent Mill Road using portable methane detectors, checking both sides of the street and moving systematically from house to house. I stood on our front lawn and watched them work, Nadia asleep against my shoulder eventually, her weight solid and warm. Adiz had gone to knock on the Fontaine's door and then worked her way down the block, alerting neighbors, which is the kind of practical action that occurs to Adahize in crisis situations while I stand on lawns watching things and holding children. By 10:30, 6 more households were outside. By 11:15, Midwest Natural Gas had a second crew on scene with more sophisticated detection equipment, a flame ionization detector, which is a more sensitive instrument than the standard CGI, and which can detect methane concentrations the handheld units miss at lower levels. By midnight, they had located the rupture. It was in the main distribution line running beneath the street, not at any individual property connection, which is why Phil Dearborn's inspection of my property and meter had come back clean. The line itself, a segment of cast iron pipe installed in 1971, and due for replacement as part of an infrastructure upgrade that had been deferred 3 separate times, had developed a longitudinal fracture approximately 14 inches long at a depth of 4 feet. The fracture had been leaking at a low but increasing rate. The gas had been migrating through the soil, following the path of least resistance, accumulating in basement spaces and soil pockets along a corridor that extended beneath 430 feet of residential properties, beneath 6 houses. 6 houses sketched in crayon by a 5-year-old with yellow wavy lines running underneath them. 6 houses whose residents had been sleeping above a growing methane accumulation for what the subsequent investigation determined had been at minimum 3 weeks. Fire Marshal Douglas Ibarra arrived on scene at 12:08 a.m., called in because the scope of the leak had escalated beyond standard response protocols. No, he was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with the face of someone who has seen what happens when things like this go wrong and carries that knowledge quietly in every interaction since. He spoke to Captain Solis for several minutes, then spoke to the Midwest Natural Gas crew chief, a man named Greg Winslow, then walked the full length of the blocked-off street himself before coming to find me on the sidewalk. He had a clipboard, and he took notes as I went through the timeline again. Nadia's first report, my initial dismissal, the call to the gas company, the inspector's visit, the growing smell, the evening detection, the 911 call. When I got to the part about the inspector finding nothing, he stopped writing and looked at me over his clipboard. He asked what equipment Dearborn had used. I described the yellow handheld unit. Ibarra wrote something down and didn't comment further on it, which was itself a comment. He asked if I had any documentation of the gas company call, and I said I had the call log on my phone showing the date and time. He asked me to send a screenshot to his email, which he gave me on a business card. He was about to move on when I mentioned Nadia's drawing, still taped to our refrigerator inside the evacuated house. He stopped. He asked me to describe it. I described it in detail. The 6 houses, the family names, the yellow wavy line, the label in invented spelling. He stood there for a moment and then said, quietly, that he'd like to see it when they cleared the house, if I didn't mind. I said, of course. He walked away, and I watched him go. And I thought about Phil Dearborn's detector reading background levels 3 days ago, 40 feet from a 14-inch fracture in a pressurized gas main. The street was officially cleared for residents to return at 4:43 a.m. after the gas company's emergency crew had isolated the damaged section, purged the line, and confirmed atmospheric methane readings had returned to ambient levels. Nadia slept through the return, unconscious in my arms, unaware that 6 households were shuffling back into their houses in the cold early morning with the particular exhausted relief of people who have just learned about a danger they didn't know they were in. Mr. Fontaine, who is 73 years old and lives alone since his wife passed, and who has the deliberate dignity of a man who has decided not to let anything shake him. He paused on his front walk as I passed with Nadia and said to her sleeping form that he owed her one. His voice was steady. His hands weren't. Adeze took Nadia from me at our front door, and I stood in the living room for a moment before going to the refrigerator and looking at the crayon drawing still taped to it. The smelly snake, running yellow and wavy beneath 6 imprecise but recognizable houses, drawn with complete confidence by someone who didn't know yet that adults were supposed to doubt themselves. The investigation that followed involved more people and moved faster than I expected, which I later understood was because the combination of a missed inspection and a near-miss disaster on a residential block generates institutional urgency that routine infrastructure review does not. I received a call Thursday morning from Midwest Natural Gas's regional safety director, a woman named Constance Uba, who had 16 years in natural gas infrastructure safety and the specific quality of directness that comes from spending a career in a field where vagueness costs lives. She told me she was initiating a formal review of the inspection conducted on my property by Phil Dearborn, that the review would include analysis of the equipment used, the methodology applied, and the documentation of findings. She told me the review was being conducted under the company's safety assurance protocol, and that I would receive a written summary of findings within 30 days. I thanked her and then asked, as carefully as I could manage, or whether the equipment Dearborn had used was capable of detecting a distribution line leak at the concentration levels that had been present when he was at my property. There was a pause. Then Constance Uba said that was one of the questions the review would be examining. She said it with the controlled neutrality of someone answering a question truthfully while simultaneously not confirming anything she wasn't yet authorized to confirm. I took notes on the call. Date, time, her name and title. Everything she said. I'd learned from the preceding 4 days that documentation was the difference between a thing that happened and a thing that could be verified to have happened. The formal review's findings arrived in 22 days, not 30. The letter came from Midwest Natural Gas's legal department, addressed to me, and it was 4 pages long with 2 attached exhibits. I read it at the kitchen table with Adeze across from me, reading a second copy I'd made at the library because our home printer had chosen the previous week to develop a paper feed issue. The summary of findings was written in the careful language of institutional accountability, which is a dialect of English that says significant things while maintaining deniability about exactly how significant they are. What it said, parsed from that dialect into plain speech, was this: the CGI unit Phil Dearborn had used to conduct the inspection of my property was operating with a calibration date of 11 months prior. Midwest Natural Gas's own safety protocol required calibration of handheld detection units every 6 months. An uncalibrated unit, particularly one 11 months out of calibration in field conditions, could return false negative readings at low methane concentrations. Specifically, the kind of low concentration produced by a slow distribution line fracture in early stages. The review concluded that the inspection methodology applied during the March visit to my address had been insufficient to detect the leak condition that was subsequently confirmed during the emergency response. The review did not use the word negligent. It used the phrase "did not meet current protocol standards," which is the institutional equivalent of the same thing without the legal exposure. Exhibit A was a table showing Dearborn's CGI unit's calibration history. Exhibit B was a copy of Midwest Natural Gas's internal protocol document with the 6-month calibration requirement highlighted. Where I read both exhibits twice, Adeze read them once, set them down, and said she thought we should call a lawyer. The lawyer was Priya Anand, who had been Adeze's college roommate and who had spent the last 12 years in consumer protection and personal injury law in Columbus. She drove to Millbrook on a Saturday afternoon and sat at our kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a ballpoint pen and the focused attention of someone who has heard a great many stories and has developed a very efficient system for identifying which parts matter. I walked her through everything: the timeline, the calls, the inspection, the false negative reading, the emergency response, the review letter, both exhibits. She took notes in a rapid shorthand I couldn't read and asked clarifying questions in the gaps. When I finished, she sat for a moment before she said that what I had was a documented case of inspection negligence resulting in an escalated public safety risk, supported by the gas company's own review findings. She said that the affected households on our block potentially all had standing for a claim, and that the aggregate claim would be substantially stronger than any individual one. She said she'd want to review the fire marshal's incident report and the gas company's infrastructure maintenance records for the relevant line segment before advising further. She asked for copies of everything. I handed her a folder I'd prepared, which contained the call log screenshots, my written timeline, the gas company's review letter and exhibits, and Ibarra's business card. She looked at the folder and said the documentation was excellent. Well, then she looked at the refrigerator and said, "Is that the drawing?" I said yes. She went over to it and looked at it for a long time, then turned back to me with the first completely unguarded expression I'd seen from her all afternoon, and said, "You need to keep this. Do not let it leave your possession. It's a contemporaneous record of detection that predates both the failed inspection and the emergency response." I said it was made by my 5-year-old in crayon on a Sunday morning. She said she knew what it was made of, and she said it again. "Don't let it leave your possession." Fire Marshal Ibarra's incident report was filed with the Millbrook Fire Department 8 days after the emergency response, and I obtained a copy through a public records request that Priya had advised me to file. However, the report was 31 pages, including appendices, and it was the most sobering document I've read in a professional capacity that didn't involve a grade book. The relevant findings summarized: the distribution line fracture had been developing for an estimated minimum of 21 days prior to the emergency response date, based on soil saturation data and atmospheric modeling. The leak had been progressing at a rate that would have produced hazardous methane concentrations in enclosed basement spaces along the affected corridor within an estimated 72 hours of the emergency response date. The report noted that initial detection of the smell had been reported to Midwest Natural Gas 6 days prior to the emergency response, and that the subsequent inspection had returned a negative finding. The report further noted, in a section titled Community Detection Factors, that voluntary evacuation had been initiated based on detection reported by a resident at 8:51 p.m., and that interviews with the resident indicated the detection had been preceded by 5 days of olfactory observations by a household member with, and this is the exact phrasing from Ibarra's report, apparent heightened sensitivity to odorant compounds. Apparent heightened sensitivity. I read that phrase to Adiz. She said she was going to print it out and put it on the refrigerator next to the drawing. She was joking. Mostly. The Millbrook Courier ran the story on a Wednesday. The reporter was a woman named Jess Flaherty, who covered local government and utilities and who had been tipped to the incident by someone at the fire department. I suspected Captain Solis, though I never confirmed it. Flaherty called me on a Monday, and I referred her to Priya before saying anything substantive, which Priya had specifically instructed me to do. Priya gave her a statement on behalf of the household that laid out the timeline factually without characterizing the gas company's conduct beyond what the review letter itself had stated. The story ran under the headline, "Gas Leak Missed by Inspector Detected by Millbrook 5-year-old. Fire Marshal Report Reveals." It was above the fold. The digital version had a photograph of Nadia's crayon drawing, which I'd allowed Flaherty to photograph because Priya said the story would run with or without it, and that the drawing was better served by appearing in context than being described without visual reference. The story was picked up by the Columbus Dispatch the same day and by a regional wire service by Friday. By the following Monday, I had calls from 3 national outlets, which I declined because Priya said the legal situation was still active and media engagement beyond the local story was premature. The gas company issued a statement acknowledging the review findings and announcing that they were implementing mandatory monthly calibration verification for all field inspection equipment, effective immediately, and that they were conducting a full infrastructure assessment of distribution line segments in Millbrook installed prior to 1985. The statement did not name Phil Dearborn, and it did not use the word apology, but it contained a phrase about their commitment to the safety of the communities they serve that was doing a lot of work in place of several other phrases they'd chosen not to use. Phil Dearborn was placed on administrative leave the same week the review findings were released, which I learned from a source I'd rather not identify because protecting that source still matters to me. Priya confirmed she'd seen documentation suggesting his certification status with the State Utilities Board was under review. I thought about Phil Dearborn more than I expected to. Not with hostility, exactly, but with the particular unresolved feeling you get when institutional failure is personified in a specific individual and you're trying to figure out how much of the failure belongs to the person and how much belongs to the system that let the person operate with an 11-month uncalibrated instrument and apparently didn't notice. That question didn't have a clean answer, and I stopped pursuing it after a while because the clean answers weren't going to come. And the important thing, Priya reminded me with gentle persistence, was the outcome, not the attribution. The outcome was that 7 households had civil claims against Midwest Natural Gas. Priya filed on behalf of ours and coordinated with attorneys representing 4 other households along the block. 1, the claims alleged negligence in the inspection protocol and failure to detect a known hazard after report and cited the review letter's own findings as supporting documentation. The gas company's legal team made an initial settlement offer that Priya described as a number designed to see if we were paying attention. We were paying attention. After 3 rounds of negotiation conducted over approximately 4 months, the households reached a confidential settlement whose terms I'm not going to disclose here because the agreement includes a standard non-disclosure provision. What I can say is that the settlement was sufficient to establish a college fund for Nadia to replace the 30-year-old water heater and electrical panel that had been on our deferred maintenance list for 2 years, and to cover Priya's fees with enough left for a family trip to Portugal that Adayesi had wanted to take for the better part of a decade. Whether that constitutes justice is a question I don't think I'm qualified to answer. It constitutes accountability. I'll take it. Constance Uba called me personally 3 weeks after the settlement finalized, not through lawyers, just a direct call to my cell phone. She said she was calling to tell me that the infrastructure assessment she'd initiated had identified 3 additional distribution line segments in Millbrook with similar deterioration profiles to the Crescent Mill Road segment, and that all 3 were being scheduled for emergency replacement ahead of the regular maintenance calendar. I thanked her. 1, she said the company had also revised its customer complaint protocols to require that any reported gas smell with a duration of more than 48 hours be escalated to a senior inspector with FID class equipment, not standard CGI. I said that sounded like the right change. She was quiet for a moment and then said that my daughter was going to read about this someday and think her dad handled it right. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said I hoped so. She hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while. That was the call that got me, oddly. Not the settlement, not the newspaper story, not the fire marshal's report with its careful, bureaucratic acknowledgement of what almost happened. And it was Constance Uba calling me on a Thursday afternoon to tell me that 3 other lines were being fixed because of what a 5-year-old had smelled and a tired father had eventually, belatedly, taken seriously. The drawing stayed on the refrigerator through all of it. Through the legal process and the media calls and the settlement negotiations and the Portugal trip planning. Nadia stopped paying particular attention to it fairly quickly because 5-year-olds have an admirable lack of investment in their own legacy. She'd moved on to a project involving the categorization of different types of rain by smell, which she was documenting in a journal I'd bought her after this whole thing ended. A proper notebook with a hard cover because it seemed like the appropriate response. She'd identified 4 distinct rain types so far. The one before a storm that smells like electricity. The one during a storm that smells like wet stone. The one after a storm that smells like relief. And what she called the sneaky rain, which is the kind that starts so gently you don't smell it until it's already happening. I read her descriptions and thought about what it means to go through the world paying genuine attention, not performing. Attention or performing observation as a professional habit or a coping mechanism or a personality, but actually being present to the information that the physical world is continuously offering to anyone willing to receive it. The drawing is still on the refrigerator. Nadia's in 1st grade now. She told me last week that her classroom has a different smell than our house, and she's been trying to figure out what makes it different. I told her to keep investigating. She gave me the look that children give parents who say encouraging but obvious things. Then she went back to smelling the world, which is what she's always done, which is what, it turns out, matters more than anyone in any official capacity thought to tell her before a yellow crayon and a piece of paper and her own patient certainty did it for her.